Hey everyone, great to be back with you all again. As a longtime fan of the two mainline Zone of the Enders games on the PlayStation 2, you'd think I would have tried to play this game a little sooner, and yet, here we are. Unlike the two main titles, which revolve around fast-paced action most of the time, the Fist of Mars here is completely different, using a turn-based strategy formula and large amounts of story and dialogue. Is it worth checking out now? And does it have any major connections to the other games in the series? Strap in, and we'll see just how well Zone of the Enders, The Fist of Mars for the Game Boy Advance holds up today. Developed by Winkysoft and published by Konami in September of 2001 for Japan, February of 2002 in the US, and June of 2002 for the EU, Zone of the Enders, The Fist of Mars, also known as Zone of the Enders 2173 Testament in Japan, is a tactical turn-based strategy RPG with visual novel elements. The game serves as a side story to the other Zone of the Enders titles, taking place in between the first and second games despite being its own separate story. The game follows protagonist Cage Midwell, a 17-year-old boy working aboard a ship called the Bonaparte III, along with his friend Eris Endua. One day, during a voyage, he notices a young woman going into the cargo holds. He follows her and learns that her name is Miona Alderaan. Before they can talk more about what she's doing there, the ship gets attacked by a mysterious black orbital frame, a type of mech in this game's universe. Cage and Miona escape into a nearby LEV, short for Laborious Extra-Orbital Vehicle Unit, and make their escape. After the ship blows up, Cage begins to talk with the LEV's navigation system named Farsty. Farsty is similar to Ada in the mainline Zone of the Enders games, as it provides support on top of having a really dark and direct sense of humor. The group gets attacked by the Black Frame, which prompts the first battle. Whether winning or not, the Black Frame leaves, and the group descends onto Mars. From there, we learn that Miona has amnesia, and no idea what she was doing on the Bonaparte. The group gets apprehended by local UNSF security and accused of causing destruction to the Bonaparte and UNSF facilities, while Cage fails to prove his innocence. They later find out that this entire scenario was a setup to keep the UNSF off the trail of the real perpetrators while they carried out their own set of mysterious objectives. Cage finds out that his friend Ares is still alive and helps the two of them escape the facility. They are also aided by a man named Dexon Gase, part of an anti-terrestrial league representing Mars named BIS, short for Born in Space. Cage and Miona agree to help them and become caught in the middle of a growing conflict between Earth and Mars. From here, it becomes a matter of Cage working alongside BIS to aid them in their mission against the Earth's corruption, while also working to dissolve the conflict between the two planets, solve the mystery of the Black Frame, and stop the enigmatic pilot before it's too late. Unlike the other Zone of the Enders games on the PS2, this was the first and only game in the series to not feature any involvement from Hideo Kojima of Metal Gear Solid fame, who served as the other game's producer. Instead, this title would be produced by Takashi Shimamichi and Noriaki Okamura, with the direction of Atsushi Kamata. While this game is very much part of the same world as the one seen in Zone of the Enders 1 and 2, the story, however, is its own separate entity. Most of the action elements in the PS2 games have also been replaced, though a few small touches still remain. The gameplay here is more akin to your standard turn-based tactical RPG. Turns allow you to move your various units across the squares you're given on screen, attack, whether it's ranged or a melee attack, use items, and unleash other special abilities before the enemy units have their turn, perform the same phases, rinse and repeat. There is one factor that distinguishes this game from other tactical combat games, however. It's referred to as the Interactive Attack System Interface, or IAS for short. When you select an enemy for attack, the game will flip to a cockpit view for your character, with a target reticle and a countdown timer. In order to complete the attack, you have to move it so that the enemy is in range enough, and hit the A button at just the right moment. If you manage to hit the center target, or other target areas on certain larger enemies, then you'll be able to perform a critical attack. If you hit the attack button before the enemy is in range, or run out of time on the clock, the attack will miss, and you'll have to try again next turn. A similar mechanic applies for when your enemies attack as well. You now assume a target reticle that you have to move in order to avoid the enemy's attack. If you manage to avoid their target long enough, you'll dodge the attack. If it manages to touch you, then you'll take damage. I can't say I've seen many things quite like it, though it did remind me of the space combat in Kido Senshi Z Gundam: A Way to the New Type. No? Just me? Okay. I found this mechanic to be quite interesting. It gives these battles a surprisingly open-ended feeling that almost seems contradictory to the tactical strategy RPG model itself. Once you get the hang of the IAS system and learn to dodge properly, you'll start to have a pretty easy time with the majority of the game. With that said, you also have the ability to turn it off, making the gameplay style more akin to an old-fashioned strategy RPG. Because of the IAS system, the game will likely feel either far too easy to play when you have it turned on, or far too difficult when you don't. It's like having to choose between an easy mode and hard mode with no type of normal mode to balance it all out. Still, if you're new to tactical RPGs and don't want to feel overwhelmed, this may actually serve as a good introduction for you, since there's a lot more room for error than you'd see in games like Advance Wars or the Fire Emblem series. Outside of this, there's not much else to do in battle other than strategize, fight, gain experience, and level up, though there are occasional download terminals that can be accessed by any orbital frames you may be controlling at the time. These will give your units additional attacks and abilities to help aid you in combat even further. The game also allows you to upgrade your units in between chapters by use of money that you collect from destroying enemies. This lets you enhance your HP, armor, or shell strength, and the strength of each unit's special attacks. You can also add items collected through this menu, such as repair kits and the like, as well as change each unit's balance between your power and hit rate, or your defense and evade rate. You can also save from this menu, or save in the middle of battle as well, though I rarely found that to be the preferable option. The story's progression and chapter system is meant to replicate that of a typical anime series. The game has 26 of them, each containing large amounts of dialogue, 1 to 2 battle sequences, and even more dialogue to follow it all up. And these are not short sequences of dialogue we're talking about here. Even with the fast-scrolling text, a few of these scenes went well over 20 minutes for me. This is the one aspect of the game that made me question if Kojima secretly did have some involvement in this project, as he is still the undisputed king of long cutscenes. While a lot of these scenes were in fact necessary to carry the plot along, I couldn't help but feel like some of these dragged on unnecessarily as well. It was certainly a mixed bag for me. The chapter format works well from a portable gaming standpoint, but it also made me wonder if some sections could have been condensed a little more, to make the game's progression feel a little smoother. Expect to approach these chunks of dialogue the way you would a visual novel, with the occasional bit of input from the player. The main story beats themselves are fine, however. Further delving into the political aspect of the Earth and Mars conflict, including the perspectives of the citizens of Mars, was quite interesting, as was the importance of the word Ender, a derogatory term used by the people of Earth to label colonists of Mars and Jupiter, of whom Earth currently rules over. I enjoyed these aspects of the story a lot, as it gave me an even bigger picture of just what may have been going on behind the scenes during the 2 mainline games. The idea of the main character's rebellion secretly being funded by a large organization, as well as the dynamics behind each of the villainous characters, is all pretty compelling stuff, and I was happy to see how it all played out. It also follows a lot of the same conventions as the other Zone of the Enders titles, despite its separation from them. But the story is not without its flaws either. Following the anime archetype, The Fist of Mars also has a large amount of tropes that you either love or hate to see. You've got your young teenage boy, Cage, taking control of a Lev, which turns out to be a deadly orbital frame that ends up being the key to Mars' salvation. You've also got the young girl with amnesia, Miona, who ends up being the key to the destruction of Mars. You've also got the main character's best friend, Ares, who everyone thinks is dead until showing up again later, to reveal themselves as the main villain of the entire game, assuming you went with the good ending route, of which we'll talk more about later. And it just gets more over the top from there. An enemy, Bolazov, who takes advantage of the woman he works with and disposes of them the second they're no longer quote-unquote useful to him? Check. The former friend turned enemy, Phil, who once again redeems himself and joins back with you if you get the good ending? Check. Weaker enemy, Ned, who keeps coming back, even in the form of a literal brain by the later half? Check. You get the idea. If you're a fan of the other Zone of the Enders games, then you're probably wondering, like I was, if this game has any major connections to them. While there's not too much here to speak of, I definitely noticed some things that fans may find interesting. For one, the game makes no secret that Baram, the terrorist organization from the main titles, has a presence in this game as well, specifically referring to Ares, Cage's former best friend, and Lance Jimmer, a Baram pilot who appears to show great contempt at the mention of Nomen, the antagonist of the mainline Zone of the Enders games. It was implied that he once saw Nomen as a rival, and may have even tried to murder him in the past, but we don't know any of this for sure. Another obvious connection involves all of the different lev and frame types from the mainline games, which you begin to see around the halfway point. For example, in Chapter 14 you fight with Harumaru, which closely resembles Tempest from the original Zone of the Enders, giant shell and all. This happens again with the encounter of Nerokurubina, which closely resembles Tyrant, once again from the first Zone of the Enders. Although they are extremely similar, one of the game's antagonists, Amante Furlair, mentions it is based off a quote-unquote older model. Harumaru's resemblance to Tempest is also brought up in a conversation between Dazil Zephyrs, another one of the game's main antagonists, and General Jaeger, his superior, where Zephyrs confirms that this, too, was a plagiarized version of the original. Tempest also has similar abilities to Jehuti from the original series, with moves like Comet and Halberd. You begin seeing the return of other familiar mechs like the Raptors and Mummy Heads from the main series. This next cue is more of an observation on my part, but I think it's important to share regardless. Before his defeat, Zephyrs stated that he believes Metatron, the game's main source of energy, and its use for the quote-unquote betterment of mankind, through death and destruction, is the will of God. This reminded me of Noman's statements in Zone of the Enders The Second Runner, where he stated that he believed the destruction was the quote-unquote will of Metatron itself. I don't know if there is any real connection here, as these games were once again made by different teams of people, but I do find it interesting that two villains in these games have now expressed similar sentiments, and I can't help but wonder if there's still more to this true nature of Metatron business than we're led to believe. This time we're told that Zephyr's words are a result of overexposure to Metatron, but that only makes me wonder even more. There is also one final connection made at the very end of the game, but I'll save that one for later. For now, I think it's important that we delve back into the main story. Despite all of the characters, tropes, and story points I mentioned already, there's a lot more happening both on the surface level and in the background. The series shares a lot of major elements with classic anime series like Mobile Suit Gundam, but manages to feel like enough of its own thing as well. On top of all the fighting between the residents of Earth and Mars, plenty of infighting also occurs between other corporations who have their own sets of goals while this conflict continues. And there's the local residents of Mars, some of which form their own coalition, which your party has to stop. If there's one thing you can certainly praise the writers of this story for, it's the sheer depth of its inner workings. And these conflicts lead to some variation in the level design as well. One stage may have you trying to save hostages kidnapped by your enemies in an attempt to draw you out or frame your party for political gain. Another has you trying to defeat targets stealthily, while also trying to sneak into a prison. Outside of this, there's not much difference in the design of each stage, which may start to get boring if you play each stage back to back. The revelations that come in the plot's latter half are particularly interesting though. The most shocking of all involving Miona, or her real name, Farsty Shatner, and her brother. In a huge twist, we discover that both children were kidnapped at a young age, and experimented on by Zephyrs. Farsty was used to make the AI unit in Cage's Testament orbital frame, and controlled using a pendant with music on it, a song that helps to lift the children's spirits when they were at their worst. While I was able to follow and predict a good amount of the story elements that would occur here, I admit the revelations about Farsty took me by surprise. This would go on to explain the occasional human moments in the AI's dialogue with Cage, in contrast to Ada's dialogue with Leo and Dingo in the mainline Zone of the Enders titles, which was slightly more robotic, but would also raise some truly dark questions about the AI developments in other orbital frames. The game has two endings, a quote-unquote good and bad one, with huge differences in the plot developments leading up to them. You would think that in order to trigger one of these over the other, that you'd have to do something highly specific, or make choices about what enemies you do or don't defeat, etc. But no, which ending you get is actually tied to one specific moment, way back in Chapter 12. In Chapter 12, you encounter a group of women who call themselves the Mars Angels. They present themselves as a group of thrill-seekers rather than someone following any kind of political affiliation. As the chapter begins, you team up to fight with multiple drone fighters. If you manage to defeat more drones than the Angels, then you'll get the game's good ending. If you take down less, then you get the bad ending. That's it. Yes, for a scene that appears to be so simple and throwaway, it's shockingly important, as the differences this one moment can create are huge, all the way up to who you actually face in the final battles. If you take the good ending path, then the final battles will result in a contest with Ares, Cage's long-lost friend turned main antagonist, as well as Phil, who ends up betraying BIS in order to aid Barum before redeeming himself later on. In the bad ending path, you have a completely different set of encounters with Bolazov, who was previously believed to have been defeated and killed in the earlier chapters. He joins with Barum and works to control Miona and defeat BIS once and for all. Again, I cannot stress how odd it is to have so many important plot elements all determined by one seemingly harmless chapter early on, but there you have it. I'll now talk about the good ending, since it appears to be the one that was meant to occur, and possibly follow along with the main series of games, though that has yet to be confirmed to this very day. After defeating Ares in the Black Frame, he explains his motivations in greater detail, like the way that Jimmer was more or less forcing his hand. He has one last sentimental moment with Cage, listening to the music of the pendant one more time, before going on to protect the team from a large missile attack from the UNSF, while sacrificing his life for them at the same time. Farsty joins Ares in doing the same by ejecting Cage from the cockpit and merging with Ares to save everyone and also make the same sacrifice. We get some nice follow-up scenes with the surviving members of BIS and Cage and Miona, who head off on their own personal journey together and try to pick up the pieces of their life once more. You'll remember that I said there was one more major connection to the main games that I'd get back to later, and here it is. After the credits, we have one more scene with Amante Furlair, resembling the after-credit sequences of multiple Metal Gear Solid games. She begins talking with an unknown character, advising that their plans for Barum are all underway. This character also appears to warn her about Leo Stenbuck from the first Zone of the Enders. After this, we finally find out the name of the person she's been talking with, Ridley. While this name didn't click with me at first, I soon remembered that Noman, the main antagonist of the entire Zone of the Enders series, went by the name of Ridley Hardiman, which explained everything. I'm not actually sure if the events of Zone of the Enders the Second Runner followed up on this particular bit of dialogue, as we have no idea what they were really talking about here other than Barum trying to move forward with their plans. Still, it did give me goosebumps for about half a second. I definitely enjoyed most of my time with this game, and liked a lot of the main story elements alongside the depth of the established lore. But I have to admit it's a bit of a tough sell, as the type of audience it's even meant to appeal to is very specific. It's a spin-off of an action series from the PlayStation 2, with turn-based tactical combat, and a system that can make fights shockingly easy to win once mastered. The good news is that you don't have to have played or followed the story of the other Zone of the Enders games in order to keep up with this one, though it certainly helps when all of the names and organizations start getting thrown at you from every which direction. The bad news is that even the most seasoned fans of this series may have a hard time getting through it all, especially if they want to see how both endings play out. The game is over 17 hours long, and a large portion of that consists of reading wall after wall of dialogue. I fear this game may also disappoint some hardcore fans of the series, as the connections to the other games are very loose and barely spoken of, making it so you really have to dig in order to get any new information out of it. Others will either love or hate the IAS system, as it allows you to potentially dodge all major attacks and land as many critical hits as you can possibly muster. For a player new to strategy games, I could see this helping them ease into things more, but everyone else will likely find it a little too easy for their liking. And the alternative of switching this mechanic off makes the game feel exceptionally hard, to the point where I don't imagine many beating it all the way through without having to replay stages. And that means skipping through all the dialogue leading up to it once more. If you simply have to get more Zone of the Enders in your life, like I did, then it's absolutely worth trying out at least once. But it's also important to understand that this will not look or feel like the games you already knew and loved, and that you'll be experiencing a completely different genre of game in the process. Overall, I don't believe this is a bad game by any means. It's just that it doesn't have much to make it stand out from the competition. Outside of expanding on the lore of the Zone of the Enders universe and giving us more awesome mech designs to gawk over, which I really love, I admit, there's nothing here story-wise or gameplay-wise that you can't already get from other titles that do it arguably better, like Super Robot Wars, Fire Emblem, Advance Wars, and the like. If you're a hardcore Zone of the Enders fan, check it out if you can find a copy. Just make sure you know what you're getting yourself into first. And that's going to do it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching. Have you played this game before yourself? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you're feeling generous, please consider supporting me on Patreon, where awesome people like Brandon, Thomas, Johan, Cielo, Jonathan, and Andrew all help to keep this channel going. Until next time, freedom to Mars!